So what makes a difference then when you go into a school in terms of improving behaviour? The school needs a very good behaviour policy. Now, by law, you have to have a policy, and most schools do have very good policies. The issue is around the consistency with which the policy is applied by all the adults in the building. Because all it needs is one person not to enforce some aspect of the school's rules, and there will be a consequence for somebody else. I mean, a good example would be most schools say children shouldn't wear outdoor coats in classrooms. And some children go into a classroom and the teacher doesn't say anything, they don't enforce the rule. The children go to the next classroom and the teacher says, take your coat off. And the children turn around and say, but Mr. So-and-so doesn't make us take our coats off. Now, Mr. So-and-so has just caused a difficulty. So the issue about improving the situation in schools is that you have a policy that everybody understands, that is articulated clearly, applied fairly, and is monitored by the senior managers by looking at referrals into the pastoral systems, by looking at the number of exclusions, the number of detentions, and that starts to tell you, are our policies working? What is also important is that the children are taught what behaviours you want. It's very easy to have a disciplinary code which lists everything you mustn't do. The issue is, how do you want people to talk to them? How do you model the way that you speak to young people so that they can see what it is you want back? So there are clear procedures for meeting children as they come to the classroom door. There are clear procedures that everybody follows for getting them into the room, getting them settled and starting the lesson. That when they walk into a classroom, the children understand what is going to happen in that room, because the decoration, the displays that are up, tell them what goes on in that particular curricular area. Schools need to make clear to parents what the rules are and share that information so that they understand what is required of them. It's also important that everybody understands what the reward systems are. We know from all of the research that exists that people respond to rewards and to kind words. When someone thanks you for doing something, you feel good about it. Therefore, you're more likely to do that sort of thing again. A good example, we were in an interesting school in South London where I was sitting next to a pupil and I said to him, is this a good lesson? And he said, yeah, it's all right. So I said, why is it all right then? Well, she's fair, isn't she? I mean, she listens to you. So I said, right. I said, is it a good school? Yeah, it's all right, except for Mr. So-and-so, and he named this particular member of staff. And then I said, if there's one thing you could change, what would it be? And he looked at me and he said, you see him over there, he only comes in about once a month, and when he comes in, they give him a commendation. I come here every day and I get naffle. Now, I use that illustration. What does your school do for those children that turn up every day and do exactly what you want? How are they praised? How are they made to feel important? We know that if you're a high flyer, you get lots of praise. We also know that if you are a disruptive pupil, you get a lot of attention. What happens to all the children in the middle that come in every day and do exactly what you want? There's an issue about the consistency with which adults apply the rules. If there is a lack of consistency, if the child walks into a room and they're not sure whether the rules are going to be applied, they don't know how to behave. Now, what we do know from the best practice seen in schools is where there are clear procedures, most children function well within them, even children whose behaviour can be difficult. The most effective schools have clear procedures for managing situations. They may have, for example, an on-call system where senior members of staff can be summoned if there's an incident. However, in the best practice, classroom teachers have strategies so that if things start to go wrong, they know what it is they're going to do in terms of managing that situation. Another thing that makes a difference are the systems that the school uses to monitor behaviour. Central to this is that the senior staff evaluate the outcomes so that they have some notion of who is getting into difficulty, at what points in the day and with whom. To do this, there are many tools that can be used. For example, there's the National Behaviour and Attendance Strategies Behaviour and Attendance Audit, which is carried out once a year when you interview pupils and staff and you look at what are their concerns around behaviour and attendance. Some schools also use what are called behaviour tracking systems. These are interesting because they go on to look at the types of behaviours that are around, and you agree as a staff what each of the categories mean, and then you have a logging system that flags up how many incidents take place. And by undertaking an analysis of that, you can look at where are the what are called hotspots in your school. For example, what you see in front of you is a list of descriptors of types of behaviour used by one school using a behaviour tracking system. To be able to make this work, you have to have a discussion with all staff so that you agree, for example, what criminal behaviour is, or what fighting means, or what inappropriate behaviour means in your school. Staff understand the definitions, and when an incident takes place, that is logged and the information is fed into the computer system that actually produces a printout at the end of the week of the number of incidents of types of behaviour. In this particular school, we asked for the information with a 2-week gap in it, so that by the second week there appeared to be a higher increase in incidents. But in reality, the date becomes important because it's the first week back after half term. So we said to the school, do you see that pattern repeated every time there is a break of more than 4 days? And they said yes. We said, what happens when the children then come back into school on that first morning? Well, we have a 5-minute registration and then it's back into lessons. But what this information is telling you is every time there is a long break, you need to reset the expectations and boundaries. We then said to them, can you pull this information off by time of day? And they could do. And what you see is that on Tuesday period 2 and Tuesday period 6, there are more incidents than at any other time of the week. We then said to them, could you give us that data 2 weeks further on? And although the pattern becomes more accentuated, there is still a problem period 2 on a Tuesday and period 6. So we said to the school, if you look at period 2, when do the behaviours start to occur? And they said they happen as the children arrive and in the first 10 minutes, which actually tells you that it has nothing to do with the lesson that they're in, it is to do with the previous lesson. We then said, are those 15 incidents across the age range? And they turned around and said, no, actually they're confined to 4 classes. So the 4 classes were in their PSHE lesson, that's the Personal, Social and Health Education, for the period before period 2. Something was going on where those children were then dismissed in an unfit state to be taught, so that the teacher in period 2 had to waste time settling the group. We then said, well, what is it about behaviours in period 6? And the staff started talking about volatile, aggressive behaviour manifesting itself towards the middle and the end of the lesson. We said, could that volatile behaviour be in any way connected with substance abuse? They said back to us, we don't have a drugs problem. And we pointed out, if you take 5 tablets on a Friday and another 5 on Saturday, you don't come down till Tuesday afternoon. Now, in some schools, they would have problems around behaviour around about 11 o'clock in the morning, which is actually to do with what children have been doing the night before. Now, in primary schools, if you start to look at the patterning, what it starts to tell you is that you are likely to have more incidents of poor behaviour on a Monday and towards the end of the week. And there is some connection in that between children having to go to a different location at the weekends to be with a different parent, which can be a very positive experience, or can actually resurrect all their sorts of anxieties and fears that have come about from the separation of their parents. Now, what is particularly interesting is the way that in primary schools they are acutely aware of the impact of that change of setting over a weekend and the behaviour that is then manifested and the sorts of anxieties that appear. We then said, could you pull this information off by subject of the curriculum? And they had a difficulty in science and technology. Now, it wasn't that the teaching was weak. It's that if you then start to look at the social skills and the emotional competencies you need in science and technology, they make a higher demand on the child than when they're sitting in a standard maths or history lesson. Because in those particular lessons of science and technology, you have to take responsibility for your own learning, you have to work in pairs and in small groups, and you have to move around the classroom using different equipment. So the opportunity for poor behaviour, distracting behaviour, increases. We then said to the school, if you look at the call-out system that you have, where the senior staff respond to teachers saying that they're having difficulty, what's the pattern? And in this particular school, they have a higher incidence in Key Stage 3 than in Key Stage 4. And what that starts to tell you in this particular school is that the curriculum is well matched to the pupil's need in Key Stage 4. They also have very high attendance in Key Stage 4, so they're meeting the needs of the majority of pupils. However, in Key Stage 3, the setting arrangements vary considerably. Therefore, children are having to cope with a greater variety of groupings and find that difficult. As a result of doing that analysis, the school then started to look at those arrangements and the programming, and they changed them. One of the key factors for a particular group of pupils in Year 9, which drove those figures up, were that they all had difficulty in their literacy. From Monday to Wednesday, there was no break in the curriculum, so that they spent all of their time having to read. They didn't start to touch subjects like art and drama and games until the Thursday afternoon and then Friday. So by monitoring, you can actually start to look at the pressure points in a school and adapt your systems to remove those pressure points. So as you can see, using a tracking system like that helps inform you about what's going on in your school, so that you can make adjustments to the curriculum, you can make adjustments to organisation, you can discuss issues with staff so that they can think through how they organise their classroom. Using this information helps schools when they are remodelling the workforce in terms of how do you deploy those additional adults to classrooms to support young people? How do you identify children with similar issues so that you can develop group work? Again, for example, through things like the Excellence in Cities programmes, learning mentors work with identified children who are manifesting particular behaviours and particular difficulties, so that there's a common approach to supporting them. This can involve them in doing things like paired work and group work. It can be sustained over a period of time. They can be fed back into the mainstream school system. Some schools have created what are referred to as learning support centres, where children are identified because they're at risk, because they have difficulty with their social skills, and work is done with them alongside the main curriculum to help them so that they can manage better when they're back in the mainstream classroom. That the accommodation of the school can influence behaviour. For example, if there is nowhere to go and sit socially, so you're all out in the yards and it's a rainy playtime, you come back in wet. You're sitting in rooms wet. And someone is asking you to actually learn. Your focus as a child is about the fact that my shoes are wet, my clothes are wet. So the weather influences. Accommodation also influences in terms of corridors. Some corridors are very narrow, and we have a lot of children moving through what are called in a school a central point of exchange. So you have 3 or 4 corridors joining at a particular point, and the youngsters are forcing their way through, pushing through to get to different parts of the school. That sets up aggravation and tension. If you look carefully, in most schools, the children manage that well, and they manage it particularly well when staff come out and supervise in a friendly and supportive way. In other words, they don't come out and police in an aggressive way, but they're there. They help the situation remain calm. The design of building also influences behaviour in terms of many school buildings have vast amounts of glass. Classrooms are supposed to be light and bright. They also have blinds so that the sun can be actually blocked out when you're trying to do particular types of work. If those blinds are damaged in any way, the light then, as the day progresses, is affected, and at different points in the day, children won't be able to see the whiteboard that is being used because the sunlight cuts across their vision. So what you can end up with is a situation where a teacher comments to a group of pupils because they appear to be talking to one another while the teacher is giving instruction. In fact, what the children are doing is trying to make sense of what is on the whiteboard, but they can't quite see it. If the teacher is alert, they ask what is going on, and they give the child the opportunity to explain why it is they're talking. If a teacher feels under pressure, it is very easy for them to say, "I do not want you talking." The children then sort of say, "But sir, we were trying to, I'm not interested in your excuse, I want you to pay attention." That sets up a resentment in the pupils. Now, accommodation can affect children and the way that they interact. The weather can affect children and the way they interact. The key thing about monitoring using a tracking system is it starts to highlight where the weak points are that then enable a discussion about how we remedy that. The most effective schools are those that have discussions with pupils about what needs to be done to make them feel safe, what helps them in terms of managing their behaviour. And as you will all know, when you start to get children talking about behaviour and consequences, as far as they're concerned, if children don't behave, not including themselves of course, they should be taken out and they should be nailed to the door, because that's the way that children sort of think in terms of rough justice. However, what is absolutely clear is that in any discussion, irrespective of the age, most children will tell you that they want to feel safe and secure and get on with what it is the teacher is asking of them. Similarly, from inspection evidence, we know that government initiatives such as the primary SEAL and the secondary SEBS, which is looking at the emotional and social and behavioural development of young people, can play an instrumental part in helping teachers create the materials and the lesson organisation that supports the development of those skills. What helps in all of that is good quality training for the adults in the school. And I emphasise that word, the adults in the school. Simply training teachers is not enough, because a significant part of interactions within the school day are with a range of other adults that work there. So it is about the quality of training that you use, how you bring in outside sources to talk through with you what is happening, and how the school provides the evidence from its own monitoring to say, these look like the key issues for us. What would be ways of working to resolve them? What is also important in this whole process is that the school has the confidence to recognise that things do and can go wrong, and that there's nothing wrong in admitting that. The saddest sort of school that you can go into is where members of staff say, "We don't have bullying here, it's not an issue." Bullying happens in all organisations, all types of setting. A confident organisation says, yes, those things do happen here, but this is what we do to try and minimise their impact. In exactly the same way that you can go into a school and they say, we don't have problems around behaviour. Well, all schools have problems around behaviour. They may not seem as great as in some other schools, but they are there. A lovely example. In inner areas, teachers are dealing with children, many of whom come from poor homes where there are low aspirations. It doesn't mean to say that the parents don't care, because they do, but there are greater challenges, or there are perceived greater challenges. If we go to what would be deemed a leafy suburb, if we went to a selective school, children make similar demands, but not in terms of their behaviour. So the level of challenge manifests itself in a different way. So, for example, children can ask pertinent, stimulating and important questions, but they do so to interrupt the process of teaching. The teacher gets frustrated because they want to carry on with the lesson, but they recognise that the questions being asked are highly pertinent. And that sets up a tension. So this notion that one type of school has behaviour problems and other types of school don't have them is a misnomer. Behaviours manifest themselves according to context, and in any situation they're perceived by the teacher as a challenge.